anyone watching will have to admit that they see more advertisements for personal injury lawyers than any other type of the law. Yes?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a big market. It's a lot of people get hurt. There are a lot of people who make claims, but there are certain ins and outs and certainly certain misconceptions about personal injury law that I think we're going to talk about today.
We are indeed. I guess the first one would be the amount of time it normally takes to settle a claim.
Right. Well, so, I mean, depending on the nature of the case, obviously, some can take a long time. For example, if you have a child who is injured, let's say it's a brain injury, you don't know the extent of their impairments until they hit their teen years sometimes. You see how they do in school because the brain is still developing, it's still healing, so that can take a decade to resolve. There are a lot of things that are really complicated about some cases, like if there's a psychological component or the physical, the psychological, and then a brain injury. So sometimes it takes many, many years before you even know the long-term effects of an injury.
You've seen a lot of tragic cases, a lot of traumatic events,
right.
And oftentimes there can be compensation. It never really restores anyone to a quality of life, or does it?
Well,
what is the compensation like?
You know what? The idea is in law in Canada is to try to put the person back into the situation that they would have been but for the incident. Now, obviously, you can't turn back time and take away an injury or an accident, but certainly with the treatment and the care and the rehabilitation and then some compensation for the pain and suffering and the loss of enjoyment of life, hopefully you can use the funds to replace some of the things that you used to do with something new.
I'm so glad you said in Canada, because we watch so much American television, there is a perception that it's a windfall when there's a case like this. It's very different south of the border, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think windfall is a very commonly thrown around word in our industry, and that is that, you know, really compensation is designed to sort of put you back into the place that you were before the accident.
But it's different in the States?
Well, in the States, I think it can be. In fact, in some states, you aren't allowed to sue, and in other states you can sue and get hundreds of millions of dollars. So it really is, it varies from state to state. But in Canada, our principles are those of compensation, and they're, I think, a little bit more modest than a lot of places in the U.S.
And one thing that came up the last time you were on the program, statute of limitations. If someone's in an accident, is it a 2-year period? Explain all of that.
Yeah. Typically in Ontario, the statute of limitations is a 2-year period. So from the date of the loss, you've got 2 years to commence a lawsuit. There are certain exceptions to get you outside of that. For example, in historical sexual assault cases or sexual assault cases, it's extended.
What about PTSD, something that would present many years later?
Right, so that's what we call the discoverability principle. So it's 2 years from the date that you knew or ought to have known of the impact of your injuries. And so there are cases that get commenced far outside the 2-year limitation period because the long-term effects of something may not be known until sometime after the incident occurs.